Okay. So Ulster Scots, it embraces heritage, history, language and literature, and the fact that we're going to be talking about the Rhyming Weavers means today we're focusing mostly on the language and literature. Now, in this part of the world, the whole Clandy North Down, Ards area, I'm sure you've come across the story of Sir James Hamilton and Sir Hugh Montgomery. Yes, that rings a bell, have you? In 1606, these two gentlemen arrived over here from Lowland, Scotland. The guy on the left and the guy on the right, you can see Hugh Montgomery's on the right. His artist wasn't quite as accomplished, I think, as the guy on the left. He looked rather more like a cartoon than a stately laird. But these two men came across anyway. Deals were done, which is the subject of another conversation, with King James. And the lands that had formerly belonged to Con O'Neill were divided into three. Hamilton, Montgomery and Con O'Neill got all of those. Whenever they came across, they had received all of this land, the Clandy estate heading up all around in the Ards Peninsula, and to settle that land and make some money out of it, they planted it or they settled it with Scottish families, their families, their relatives, people that they owed a grant to, and all of these tens of thousands of people landed on Ulster shores in 1606. These were the areas where they made their homes. So you'll see we're coming up round into Dundonald. The brown territories are the Hamilton lands. The Montgomery lands are the sort of purple area, and the areas that belong to Con O'Neill remain in white. The reason why it's kind of fragmented like that and not all just in nice, neat blocks is because they wanted access to the east coast, and that was for trading, that was for access backwards and forwards to get family and people into Ulster and to get their goods and services out. So do many of you live in any of those areas? Bang, yes, there's quite a few of you from those areas. I'm from Cumber myself, so I'm right. If you look at Cumber, I'm actually in the border of brown and purple, and what's very interesting is there were two Cumbers. There was Cumber that we know it today, which has been there from early times, and then they also, because Hamilton wanted a Cumber as well, he established what he called New Cumber, which is down the road that would take you to Castle Espy, if you know it. So, but there's geological mapping surveys have been done and shown where it was. So anyway, all of these Scots arrived over here, and with them they brought many things. They brought industry, commerce, and those trading links that we mentioned, which is why they wanted the ports. They brought architecture, different farming techniques, ways of land division and fencing off fields, town planning patterns. If you know any towns that are based around a central diamond or square, that usually gives you a clue that that has been designed by Scottish settlers over here. They brought Presbyterianism, the whole Presbyterian way of life came across here with the Scottish settlers. They brought political structures. A few years ago there was a lot of commemorations going on about the town charters. There were touring exhibitions all around Belfast commemorating the granting of charters. They brought this Lowland Scots language. They brought sport and they brought education. So the Scots brought an awful lot of culture and heritage with them whenever they arrived in Ulster. Now, importantly, they also brought their Scottish surnames. These aren't all of them, this is just some of the main family names of the people who arrived in the Hamilton estates. Any of you recognise your surnames in there, or names you know? We've got a few Scots amongst us. And then the Montgomery, the main names of people who landed in the Montgomery estates were some of those, and obviously the spellings have changed over time quite a bit as well. Sometimes as well, say you had a very common name like Smith. Say you were John Smith and the man down the road was John Smith and the man a few fields away was John Smith. You might sometimes say, I'm John Smith, I came with the Montgomerys. I'm John Smith, I came with the Hamiltons. And that kind of became then that you were John Montgomery and you were John Hamilton. So a lot of people with those surnames who think that they've got Hamilton and Montgomery blood are really slightly mongrel themselves, you know. There's a lot of that went on. Our genealogy is a bit of a mix-up over here. But one of the main things that they brought with them was the language and literary tradition. And today we're going to talk about Ulster Scots poetry, and in particular the rhymes of a group of writers known collectively as the Weaver Poets or the Rhyming Weavers. It's a slight misnomer in that they weren't all weavers. It's a bit like when you talk about the romantic genre and the romantic poets, they certainly weren't all romantic. It's just one of those groupings, and we talk about the Rhyming Weavers because an awful lot of them did weave or were involved with the linen industry. They mainly lived, wrote and flourished, I suppose you would say, between the late 18th century, it's kind of around about the time of the 1798 rebellion around then, right up to the early 20th century. The last person that we kind of delineate as being in this genre is a poet called Thomas Gibbon, and he was from Cullybackey, and he stopped writing just as World War I broke out. So you can kind of mark those two waypoints on the timeline of vernacular poetry. Many of them were from counties down in Antrim, but you did find them in other areas as well. And there was a very significant trend in Ulster at that time towards what we call this vernacular writing, writing the way the people spoke, writing in the language of the common man, as opposed to the fanciful, highfalutin way that maybe English poetry and stuff you might come across, you know, poetry you have to work out what it means. They just wrote as if they were chatting to you and me. They made it very, very accessible poetry. They were influenced in all of this, of course, by Robert Burns. Now, some people say that Robert Burns influenced our rhyming weavers. That wasn't necessarily the case, because our rhyming weavers were writing first. So they were here writing in Ulster Scots before Robert Burns made it so popular in Scotland. We'll come back to Robert Burns again in a wee minute. Have you heard of any of these writers? This is a question, just make noise as I show your hands. Robert Huddleston of Monterey. Yes, got one person's heard of him. Francis Boyle of Grantia. Andrew Mackenzie of Donagoura. Edward Sloan of Conlig. George Francis Savage Armstrong of Strangford. James Orr of Ballycarry. I would hope I got a few of those, yeah. David Herbison of Ballymena. There's a long, long list of these poets. I see somebody here knows a little bit about them, but there's an awful lot of people shaking their head. They were really, really popular and loved in their day. Their poems, they sent them into newspapers. People were hungry for them. In the same way that Charles Dickens, you know, serialised Oliver Twist and whatever in the papers, and people could hardly wait for it to come out. It was the same with our papers over here, the Belfast Penny Journal, the Northern Star, the Northern Whig, the Belfast Newsletter. People were saying, oh, hope there's a poem by James Orr next week. It was exciting stuff at the time. But by and large anyway, although we did have poets, there was a lady poetess called Sarah Leach in Donegal, and William Starrett came from Strabane, but by and large the majority of the rhyming weavers were in counties Antrim and Down. So as well as writing in this very familiar language, they wrote about subjects which the listeners could understand, things that we can still appreciate today. They talked about the terrible weather outside, they talked about bad landlords, they talked about their animals, their feelings, their love, their neighbours. And that writing about landscape and place has significantly influenced modern poetry, like Seamus Heaney, the late Seamus Heaney and Michael Longley. They're all about writing about the place where you live, and that was very much a trend established by the Weaver poets. But just to go back a little bit, the Weaver poets would have been entirely lost to us really, had it not been for the poet John Hewitt. You've all heard of John Hewitt or come across him. He was doing his PhD thesis in 1951, and he'd been down in the Linen Hall Library, and he discovered these little handwritten manuscripts, these little books of poems. And again, some of the poems that might have had BPJ 1846. Anyway, that's the Belfast Penny Journal. So he'd get the Belfast Penny Journal, and right enough, there it was, published in this paper. And lots of people writing in the next week saying, boys, we love that poem, that was great, more of the same, please. He started gathering all of these up and realised that we had this tradition of vernacular writing. So he wrote his thesis in this, he researched and researched. All of his notes and all of his material is up in the library at the University of Coleraine, and I have gone through box upon box of it, and he discovered much more than ever even went into his thesis. He submitted it to Queen's, and the professors and the doctors and lecturers up there said, what's all this about? Have you made it all up? And made them take him down to the Linen Hall Library and to the newspaper records office to prove that this actually existed, because that was how lost the poets had become. So anyway, another useful thing about the publications is some of the poets did have the money to publish little books. A lot of them didn't. They just sent to the papers or had their own wee manuscripts. But some of them did decide to put together a book. It's like if you had a friend who was writing lots of great poetry and you thought it was brilliant, say, oh, you should do a wee book of that. So people said to, for example, James or Samuel Thompson, get a book put together. But paper was very expensive back in the day, and printing and publishing was exorbitant as well. So what they would do, they would say to all of their friends, well, look, I'll do that, but I can't really afford the printing costs. So if you all give me £1 or whatever, a sixpence or whatever towards it, that'll pay for the printing. It'll also get you your copy, and I'll put your name in the front of it as a little acknowledgement and immortalise you that way. So again, if you're interested in family tree research, this is an area that's often overlooked. You know, you can find these lists of names and where they lived in a lot of these books. I discovered an ancestor of mine in a James Orr book, which was just great, because I thought, well, that's why I love him, it's genetic. So that's later on, John Hewitt's thesis, all the research was published in this wee book, Rhyming Weavers and Other Country Poets of Antrim Down. I have a copy of it in my bag if any of you want to have a wee look at it afterwards. It's cheap, you can get it on Amazon or the internet for £2 or £3, or you can buy it brand new in the bookshops, I think for £6 or £7. It's a really good overview. If you're interested in what I say here today, this book is by the Black Staff Press publishers. It gives you samples of the poetry of all of the writers and tells you a little bit about their lives. So, what am I going to tell you now? I'm completely off the script, I'm making up as we go along here, just chatting to you. Rhyming weavers, where does the weaving come in? You've all heard of Irish linen and Ulster linen. You all know that we were, Belfast was known as Linenopolis for a while, you know, because we really were the textile industry of Western Europe. Flax itself, linen is obviously made from flax, and flax is a natural material. Its growth and harvest are subject to nature. The whole process of making linen is very laborious, very pain consuming, but we're really good at it here, and linen is an incredibly versatile material. It says that Irish linen has soothed the brows of royalty, so that's the Queen's handkerchief, you know, and absorbed the sweat of the working class. That's the old linen shirts that the labourers would have had on. As outerwear and underwear, it has clothed men, women and children from birth to death, the rich and powerful, the poor and pitiful alike. Irish linen is an incredible material, and right across the world, it's made in France, it's made in Poland, it's made elsewhere, but Irish linen is the benchmark against which it's always measured. You know, it's the best in the world. Whenever the linen was made, and it's a whole process, I'm sure you've heard about the linen process, the pulling the flax and the soaking it in the lint holes and retting and scutching and all the grim procedures that went on before you actually made your web of linen. Once you eventually had it, it went to this building. Who knows where that is? Belfast City Hall, the former Belfast City Hall, exactly, the White Linen Hall. There were linen halls in different cities. There was one in Lisburn and one in Newry. There were linen halls, you see linen hall streets in different towns across Northern Ireland. But it was gone up here, and from that drapers and merchants would have bought the linen. It was brown at that point. They bought the brown linen and they would have taken it to bleach greens and laid that out in the sun. It was a very long process anyway. But a lot of people in Ulster were involved in this linen. The process of the weavers weaving the flax and weaving the thread was a very, very difficult, dirty, painstaking process. That's the inside of a weaver's cottage, and you can see that the loom has taken up most of the space. He had all of the paraphernalia in there. He had got, you know, thread and looms and shuttles and lumps of flax and all the kind of dusty, dirty old things you'd have had. If you've ever been down to the Folk and Transport Museum on a linen day, or if you've been at a weaving demonstration, those things are noisy. You know, you're sitting there peddling the loom and the shuttles are flying backwards and forwards. There's a lot of racket going on in the room, and of course you're sharing that with your family, your little cottage. Your family are all rattling about in there as well. The dogs, the cats, maybe a few chickens scraping around the floor, and you're trying to keep everything clean. Also, because of the tax on windows and stuff, people had very small windows. You've heard of daylight robbery. We were being taxed on the amount of light coming into your house. So they had little small windows and very poor light, and an awful lot of these people wound up with eye difficulty and visual difficulties from peering in the dimly lit room. But the weavers sat there anyway, and their families would have worked around them. And one weaver said, "I have a wee girl who never gets off the loom from daylight in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. She is only 13 years of age, and she can earn 8 or 10 pence a day." That's a hard day's work. Could you imagine many 13-year-olds nowadays sitting on the loom, you from scrape it on, as they would say, until 10 o'clock at night? So that's Grey Abbey. If any of you recognise it, Grey Abbey was very much associated with linen and weaving, and also spinning, and a tradition called sprigging and fluorine. If you've heard of that, that was where the big linen places in Glasgow would send their white linen over here, and our ladies would do sprigging and fluorine, so sewing little tiny flowers and things onto it, making wee eyelets and fancy edgings for it, and we had a great talent for that over here. It was like a cottage industry for the people of this area. There's a picture of flax. It kind of all came to an end really in the 1830s. This was the decline of the cottage industry, when they mechanised spinning first of all, so you'd see the ladies at their spinning wheels. Instead of that painstaking process where they were pricking their fingers and people were falling into sleep for 100 years and all the things that went on with spinning wheels, they mechanised this and people started moving up to Belfast. Weaving was mechanised by the 1850s, so the weavers sitting in their cottages, a single man at a single loom labouring hard, what he could do in a week could be churned out in an hour by the machinery. And right in the middle of that, of course, we had the Great Irish Famine. So that was another reason for people to start flocking to Belfast to look for work, to look for food, to look for shelter. So that mid-19th century really brought the whole linen and weaving tradition in Ulster to an end. Sounds to me like I'm going up and down. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I've talked about the fact that it was quite a lonely trade, sitting there deafened to the noise, the bobbin going up and down, making his linen. And while the weaver would be sitting there, he'd be thinking about what was going on in the world outside him. He might be thinking about the sermon he'd heard in church that week. He might be thinking about a big row between his neighbours. He might be thinking about some scandal down the countryside. He might be wondering where he was going to get his flax because the weather was so bad. And as that went back and forward, it made a little rhythm. And if you ever read any of these poems, you'll find they are very, very rhythmic. You know, and obviously I would like to think of them sitting there, getting their rhythm for their poetry from the loom, going backwards and forwards. So I mentioned earlier, oh, that's just a wee picture. If I look at the state of them, you can imagine the goat wandering into the house there, couldn't you? Did you ever know where the expression "it's raining cats and dogs" came from? Some of you know. Well, they all had the old thatched roofs, and everybody was in that cottage, so the heavens opened like they do in June in Northern Ireland over here, and everybody dashed inside, and the cats and the dogs dashed inside, and people had, shoo, get out of here, get out of here. So they went up into the thatch and made lovely nests in the thatch. But if the rain was hard enough, the whole roof came down and the dogs and cats with it. So that's where you get the expression, "it's raining cats and dogs." I'm off the script again. Anyway, I mentioned earlier about Robert Burns. Our poets, or our writers over here, absolutely loved him. They were just dying about Robert Burns. And it was said that every home in Ulster had two books, the Bible and Burns. The Bible was thumbed from beginning to end. They knew, they read it, they were all very devout people. The Burns was very, very, even more possibly, dog-eared and soiled and thumb-marked. But there was one section of the Burns book that they never looked at. It was pristine. Have you any idea what that would be? The glossary. They didn't need to look up what these Scots words meant. You know that wee sleekit, curran, timorous beastie? Folk in England and folk in France and all the places it was being exported, they were going, what's all this about? And they were having to look up the glossary at the end, but we never needed to consult the glossary because we already knew all of those words. Now, this wee map shows that blue parts of Ulster where nowadays you would find the Ulster Scots language most commonly spoken. So that's people who would say hus and licht and scunnered and crabbit and oxter and thran and thole and all those words that probably a lot of you still know. You hear them mostly in those kind of turquoise areas. On my map it's blue, something's happening in there, but those kind of darky green areas are where you're likely to hear that way of speaking. The pale lilac areas on your screen are what we call mid-Ulster English, you know, so that would have almost elements of Shakespearean words and stuff in it. You'd hear that round south down and right up through the Antrim belt. Then we've got Hyperdo English and we've got something else. What did I miss out there? South Ulster English as well, the purples. So, and some of those languages were coming up from the Pale with the Anglo-Normans and excuse me, there were also some influences from Vikings and stuff, but it's not a complete map. But basically you can mark there in those turquoise areas where you're most likely to hear Ulster Scots being spoken. Now this next map shows where you find the Ulster Scots poets. And you'll see there's quite a correlation there. The weaver poets, I should say, nearly all the weavers who were writing poetry tended to be clustered in those Ulster Scots speaking areas. So wherever you all live there, I'm not sure where you all come from today, but you can see certainly around the North Down, South Antrim area, there's a whole big rash of them. Up in the very north we've got John McKinley, he's the poet of Dunseverick, he writes a lot about Rathlin and things. And over in the west we've got a few as well, but there tends to be a great big clump of them around this easterly part of Ulster. Now what's that? I'm going to introduce some of the poets to you now. The guy who's known as the father of the Rhyming Weavers is a man called Samuel Thompson. Let's see if I can even find the script. I'll never worry about the script. He is known as the Bard of Carngranny. They're all known as the Bard of somewhere, it's just a trend. Carngranny it's near Mollusk. There's like a big old dolmen thing there called Carngrania, the Carn of the Sun. It's just sort of outside Mollusk, and he lived in that area known as Lives Hill. Father of the weaving poets, he wasn't a weaver, he was actually a teacher, and he is one of the earlier writers. There are two that we know of that are earlier than him, but he was prolific and actually had books published. Now I'm going to play you a wee clip, hopefully you'll be able to hear it. I'm going to play you a wee clip of one of his poems being read. But the important thing to remember is that the weavers were literate, they could read the newspapers, they could write, they could make their mark, but most of the people in the area couldn't read and write and couldn't read the newspapers, so they would gather at the homes of the likes of Samuel Thompson and he would read to them. So if he said to them, right, I wrote a wee bit of a poem here earlier on today, I'm just going to read it to you. They understood every word of what he was saying. Now that's important because I'm going to play you this and I'm fairly sure you're not going to understand every word of what he's saying. So what it shows very clearly is that 250 years ago, the language of the common people, the way people spoke, the way they communicated and listened and understood is very different from the English that we speak nowadays. So let's see if you can hear any of this.
What sares to bother us in sonnet? About chin and cheek and brow and bonnet, just churling like a withered linnet, through bushes lurching. Love stangs are ill to toll, I own it, but to my hurt. Thou grimaced far a gruesome tykes, grubbing thy food by thorny dykes, good faith thou dinna want for pikes, baith sharp and rocking. Thou looks lurch safes arrayed in spikes, a creeping heckle.
Could you hear that? No, not really. It's a disaster. It's hopeless that we don't have any sound here. It's scunner you. But anyway, there's another word for you. So it doesn't make an awful lot of sense. Sure it doesn't. It's definitely not English as we would speak it. But if I tell you now that the folk that would have heard this, that's just 2 verses out of a longer poem. But whenever he got to that last bit and said, thou looks, Lord save us, arrayed in spikes, a creeping heckle, everybody would have been rolling around laughing. No, doesn't seem that funny to us nowadays. But these were people involved in the flax industry, as I've said. One of the stages of flax preparation was a job called hackling, done by a hackler, a flax hackler, and he used these big combs to pull it through, and he's describing the hedgehog as a creeping hackle, you know, like the combing. But there's also a bit of a thing going on in here, because he's saying, good faith thou dinna want for pikes. So pikes are, you know, like the sharp spears. He's writing at the time of the 1798 rebellion, when people, the United Irishmen, are all out trying to make weapons and get themselves ready for the Battle of Antrim. With the poets, with the vernacular poets of this time, their work appears to be quite superficial. It appears to be about a hedgehog. The Ulster Scots word for a hedgehog is a urchin. So you might think he's talking about a hedgehog, but once you start digging into it, you discover he's actually sending out a few messages here. Come on boys, get ready, get your pikes ready, we're going to be turning out in Antrim here in a week or two. The same with James Orr, he did one called Written in Winter, and it's, if you look at it, it just appears to be about the terrible weather, the snow everywhere and no sign of the green. And again, there's hidden messages in there. The snow is kind of the oppression and the green is the United Irishmen. Are you okay? Can you hear?
Yeah, I was just going to say, is a hedgehog now also the name of a military formation? So it's a tool.
It could be.
But it's also a military formation which was used by the United Irishmen. So to a hedgehog had a double meaning.
That's excellent. I didn't know that at all. That's a really useful contribution. Thank you very much. So that's an early example of Ulster Scots, you know, and that's Samuel Thompson, the Bard of Carngranny. Living at the same time, but a couple of years younger, was James Orr at the Bard of Ballycarry. I am sure he looked nothing like this. So, he looks a bit like Heathcliff or something, doesn't he? Yes. Somebody drew this for a festival that they were having in Ballycarry. I'm positive he was nothing like that at all. The hair was wrong and everything. If he looked like that, we almost wished he'd lived 200 years ago. But anyway, he is one of the best known, and he's definitely one of the most talented of the poets. He was a really, really talented, clever writer. He wrote in both English and in Ulster Scots. Born in 1770 in Ballycarry, you all know where Ballycarry is, kind of up on the road to Larne, kind of past Carrickfergus, past Whitehead, up that way. It's also the home of one of the oldest presbyteries in Ulster as well, up at Temple Corrin there, you know, so it's a real Ulster Scots heartland. And when you're standing up there at Ballycarry, you can see Scotland as clear as day, you know, just across the water. He wrote poetry that the people absolutely loved. He wrote about potatoes, he wrote about birds, he wrote about the landscape and the view all around him. He wrote about rural hardship, he wrote about the hypocrisy of the church, you know, because they were very anti-tithing at the time. All these Presbyterians were having to pay a tenth of everything they earned into the established Church of Ireland. Their marriages weren't recognised. We were going through the penal times at this period, and they were all bitterly resentful, you know, of the restrictions imposed upon them by the established church. So there's a lot of hidden digs at the Church of Ireland as well, hidden in all of his poetry. But he was a younger man during the 1798, being Heathcliff, being a passionate type. He got caught up in the whole thing, and turned out he actually marched with Henry Joy McCrack and with Jemmy Hope and with all those other Irishmen to the Battle of Antrim. I'm sure you all know the story. They snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. I think they say it all went horribly wrong at the last possible minute. He went into hiding. He hid on Slemish. They retreated first of all to Donagoura Hill, and when they retreated to Donagoura Hill, there were people herring off and all business. Instead of staying together to launch a second attack, you know, they were trying to gather the troops. They were all clearing off this way and that and deserting. It was a bit of a disaster. So then he went into hiding in Slemish. From there he went into exile. He made his way to America, and he's done a very interesting poem called The Passengers about the trip at that time to America, which just sounds hideous. It would put you off ever going on a boat again. But one of his best known poems is called Donagoura Hill, and this recalls that desperate day in June 1798 when the United Irishmen attacked the town of Antrim. So I'll play you a wee clip of this now, if you can hear it. Are you sound? Oh, well, we might have helped. I'll play it anyway, and we'll hope for the best.
The dewdrops sweat the field of bread, the war horse Thompson, and falls without thy money a hair to a long bear night to lay tortured. What shields were grudged to be say taxed and tied by rack-rent glothery, turned out en mass as soon as axed, and uncut truthier squathery were we that day, while closely crabbies raised the hordes of pikes, pike shafts, forks, firelocks, some melted lead, some saw deal boards, some head like hens and barnyards, wives but with tears instead of water, and lasses made cockades of green, for chaps were used to flatter their pride out day.
Did you hear one word of that?
No.
What a debacle. Never. What he's talking about here is the state of the place really all around you because of the 1798 rebellion. The guys are all getting ready, they're heading out into battle. Something that I always find quite poignant is they were all farmers. It was June, the crops were in the fields, they were all flat out busy with their day-to-day work, but they were so impassioned, they'd been pushed to the extreme, and they felt they really had to do something, and they decided that they were going to turn out in June. They gathered together their pikes, their sticks, their grapes, their hoes, everything they had, ready to march in battle in the Battle of Antrim. And when they woke up, they didn't know what they were going to wear. These were farmers, you know, and this is something that always kind of gets me a wee bit. They were, what do you wear to battle? So they put on their Sunday best. I always think there's something quite sad about that. Their Sunday best is what they put on and headed off with their sticks to fight the militia and the infantry who'd got cannons, who'd got weapons, who'd got uniforms, who were absolutely equipped to tear them to shreds. It's kind of always reminds me in some way, on a very, very small level, of the psalm, the innocents heading to the slaughter in some ways. But that's the end of that first verse where it says an unco truthier squathery. That's the older word for through other. You know, it means a right through other bedraggled looking squadron of men were we on that day. You know, we hadn't a clue really. And above it he said, when shields, that's when young men who grudge to be, say, taxed and tithed by rack, rent, blouthery. What he said there is young men were really resentful at having to pay this tithe to these nobility who kept on putting the rent up and up and up, you know. So, but again, the people he read this to would have understood every word of it. They wouldn't have required any kind of explanation. In the second verse, he's talking, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, croppies. They shaved their heads very close to the United Irishmen. They cropped their heads kind of in the style of the French Revolution. They got together whatever weapons they could, pikes and forks, and some of them had a few guns, and some were sawing boards to try and make sharp things. Others hid like hens and byron nukes. These were the cowardly ones, so, you know, are you coming out to play? No answer. They're cowering if they don't want to be part of it. Wives baked oatcakes, bonneter oatcakes for their husbands with tears instead of water. And the young girls made these green cockades to pin in the caps or pin on the lapels of the young men who used to whisper sweet nothings to them every day. That's instead they're heading off to war. So there's quite a lot of verses of this Donagoura Hill again. Most of it I think is in that little book. That's just a sample to show you. He's telling a fabulous story here, but he's telling in a language that nowadays we have to work at. So, James Orr, I told you went into exile. He came back following an amnesty some years later, but most of his friends had been slaughtered in Antrim. He was terribly discouraged. He had been so idealistic and now all hope was gone, as it were. He turned to drink, as so many do, and he died. Well, he was only 46 when he died. That is his cottage. That's the cottage where he was born and grew up. Nowadays it's in someone's garden in Ballycarry. It's still there. They use it to keep their lawnmower and things in. There is sort of, I think, the locals are trying to encourage them to perhaps think of the wider community and create some kind of museum, but it's a useful outhouse, you know. Where else would they store their buckets and stuff? So I'm not sure what way that'll go. But he is very much remembered in Ballycarry. He has a fabulous monument in his grave, which is there. It's a Masonic monument because he was very much involved with the Masonic Lodge. And there's also a weaver's trail, and if you ever find yourself in that direction, you can drive around, you can pick up nice literature, like wee driving routes and walking routes, and go around various places of interest in that area. Now, coming forward then, another lot of years, David Herbison, who was born, 30 years after James Orr, he's the Bard of Dunclug, and this actually is quite what he looks like, and that was his home in Dunclug. You can see he lived right up until pretty much the end of the 19th century, and he was kind of in his prime during that whole period we talked about with the industrialisation, with the Irish famine, when the weaving industry was starting to come to an end. He was a weaver. He had been apprenticed to the loom as a young boy, and this was his trade. He sat in the lower room in that house doing his weaving, but all of a sudden, no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't keep up with what the factories were putting out in Belfast. He had a great passion for poetry and for books, and he was very much influenced by Robert Burns, so quite a few of his poems would remind you of Burnsian poems in a way. So I'm sure, we mentioned earlier, we sleek at Cúr and Timorous Beastie, that's Robert Burns' Tamus. Well, David Herbison also wrote a poem, Tamus, and I'm going to play you a wee chunk of this. Hopefully you'll hear it this time, and you'll understand this one a wee bit better. What's happening is this wee mouse, he's cursing the thing, okay? It's been roaming about his house creating chaos. It's been stealing his books, and I told you paper was hard to come by. It's been chewing the pages and dragging them into his mouse hole to make a lovely wee nest, and he's after it. So that's the background, and you can see what you understand.
You're from which one was it?
That one.
I'm just trying to put some of these ones.
Okay. Fingers crossed.
There's a plan?
No, it's not doing anything.
No, leave a plan there. Right, can you... I've turned up all these volumes.
Okay, nothing's working, so I'm going to start that again for you so you can maybe hear it.
I'm cursed upon you, worthless. You're grown of late, say very cruise. You never fail to range the house from wall to wall, destroying things that are of use when I'm awa. Nor did you fail my books to paw, and tear my poems and signs awa. Full often I was forced to draw them frae your bed, when scarce a line among them all could well be read. Should ye e'er appear again to sport along o'er old Hearthstane, my cat or trap I'll hae you ta'en.
you sing away full strain, one in my poor.
Yes, we're just going to try something again here. You understood a wee bit more of that? Yes. Okay, good. Yeah, that's plugged in. Okay, there you go. Yay!
You're grown of late, say very cruise. You never
Well done, thank you. That looked good now.
Destroying
Hooray!
very use when I'm a war. Nor did you fail my books to talk and tear my poems and songs away. Full often I was forced to draw them frae your bed, when scarce a line among them all could well be read. But should ye e'er appear again to sport along our old hearthstone, by capital trap I'll hae ye ta'en before an hour. I'll knock ye sing away full strain, one in my poor.
Okay. So you see the Scots, there's still a few words there, but it's becoming much more understandable to us now, much more English. We're getting into the realm of mechanisation. People are moving to Belfast. Standards of literacy are improving. People are reading, they're reading the Bible, which is the King James Bible, so it's in English. You know, they're starting to read more newspapers and things which are in English. So the Scots in the rural communities, you know, for subjects like weaving and ploughing with horses and working with linen, there's still a lot of Scots vocabulary, but new words are coming in for the industrial era, and so there's more and more English being used there. So there's a few words like in line 2, you're grown o' late, say very crus. Crus is bold and cheeky. He's ranging the history, wa to wa, that's to wall to wall. Fray for from, wheel for well. To sport along or out hearthstone, that's just the fireplace, that's just the hearth, you know. And the rest of that's quite obvious, I think. So I was telling you that Herbison lived during the period of the decline of the hand loom weaving. Mechanisation was replacing the cottage industries. People could make it a lot cheaper in the factories. Oh, not again, fed up with that mouse now. He lived in Dunclog and he worked in Ballymena. I'm going to play a short clip of a poem that he wrote, kind of wishing for the good old days. We all do that, it's always been going on. I'm kind of giving off about the fashions of the young ones, so some things never ever change.
Since I was a boy in my ain native town, there's nothing but begging them, poo and was doing. The streets are growing wider, the houses are high, and half of the windows peer into the sky. Their doors would let in only church for the street. Their owners ne'er think o' a shoe for their feet. They arm hae boots ere they venture abroad. Their clothing appears to an old body odd. Who changed for the times when our forefathers lay in houses weel streaked wi' heather and stray? Happy hames, happy hearts, we had ilka place room when I was a boy in my ain native town.
So you can understand where that their clothing is just their clothing, obviously, you know. Biggin and pooing was doing. Biggin is building, and then you're building and demolition. It's always going on. You want to see the state of Cumber at the minute with this public realm work, sure, ever's going on, you know. So it's nothing ever changes. He was complaining about it 150 years ago. We're all still complaining about it. Houses we'll streak it with heather and stray. That's thatched. That's the lovely thatched roofs he's talking about there. Streak it is like straw stretched out. Thatched. So now I'm going to play a wee bit now, tell you a wee bit about this poet, George Francis Savage Armstrong. He's one of my favourites. He's dead understandable. He's moved forward another chunk now, so you see he actually lived into the 20th century. He was born and grew up near Glastra, which is down near Ballyhalbert on the Ards Peninsula. The family subsequently moved down to Dublin and he got a Dublin education, but he was very doted on his mum, and his mum was broad Ulster Scots from down that peninsula, and she was also one of those great women who's full of stories and lore and folklore and full of wee tales and things that just captivated him as a boy. So she died quite young and he made it his life's work to travel around the Ards Peninsula and Clandyboy and up the whole Lochiel area, you know, up around both sides of the loch, gathering everything he could find in terms of ballads and poems and folklore and that sort of stuff. And in 1901 he published a book called Ballads of Down and collected them all together, and there's some marvellous poems in that. If you live anywhere in this area, you'll find your place mentioned in one of them. I'm going to play you a wee bit from one of his spooky poems called The Haunted Hill. And you'll find there's some beautiful Scottish words in this, but you can pretty much understand it all now. So we've jumped right forward and you'll see the Scots is more and more and more diluted and the English is coming up. But keep an eye out for some of the nice words. In line 3 there's a word yestreen. I like that. That's a contraction of Scotland of yesterday evening. Yestreen is much nicer than last night, isn't it? What were you at last night? What were you doing yestreen? It's nicer. Okay, I'll give you a go at this.
Old Nancy breathing, her skinny hand laid cold on Donald's shoulder. I seen your doom yestreen, she cried, what turf and cinder smoulder. I seen your doom, young Donald Greer, in the fire to warn me. For I have loved tae weel, to mock my years and scorn me. Then,
oh, it's meant to be another page. I'll read it for you anyway myself. Then dinny crass ard keen at nicht, when winter's murk and dreary. Mang a the lonesome nooks and airds, by nicht there's nane sae eerie. Thon Castle Hill is haunted grun, by elves and ghasts it's guarded. There spectre chieftains pace the fields, o'er which lang syne they lord it. Young Donald laughed with cruel scorn, gang hame till Port of Ogie. I'm nae the lad to cur with fear at curse of witch or bogey. This nicht the owl kirk's ruined wa I'd climb a foot of lather, and where the conies root the graves a deed mon's bairns I'll gather. Did you understand that? So he's the old woman's predicting some awful things. She's saying don't be going anywhere near that old haunted church. There's awful things pacing around there, and he's laughing and saying, "Ah, I'm the boy, I'll be getting in there tonight, nothing frightens me." That line, where the conies root the graves, do you know what a coney is? A rabbit, that's right. There's the rabbits have been digging about, making the burrows, and there's bones out everywhere. So terrible things happen to young Donald, but you'll have to get the book if you want to know. So now, Rev WF Marshall, the Bard of Tyrone, much loved by everybody. You'll probably recognise these 3 lines. Wait till I play them for you.
I'm living in Drumlister, and I'm getting very old. I have to wear an Incan bag to save me from the cow. And even a man in this town land was cleaner there than me. But I'm living in Drumlister, and clabber to the knee.
You all heard that one? Don't think people of Drumlister are too delighted that that's all their townlands ever regarded as being a place where you get clabbered to the knee. But although he was from Tyrone, which is kind of that mid-Ulster dialect that we were looking at in the map, he ministered in Castle Rock, and Castle Rock is within sight near enough of the Mull of Kintyre in Scotland, and the people up there had this broad Scottish dialect, which just was like music in his ear. He absolutely loved it, and he embraced it, and he wrote quite a lot of his poems using this vernacular script of his. Some of them, like he does one called Sarah Ann. He's talking about the father-in-law, and he says, "Did ye ever know wee Robert? Well, he's nothing but a wart, and you're a gone old devil with a wee black heart, girding in the chimney corner, or when happen on a stick, something, 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 he be's neither weel nor sick." You know, he's great at using words and painting great pictures, but the poem that I'm going to play has nothing to do with that. See me, I don't even know why I bother with the script. This is because I was talking about the theme of wars in 1798 and how there's almost like a pattern coming through. The poets are writing about what's going on in the world around them. He lived through the two great wars. He lived through both of our world wars, and he lost his younger brother Fred. They all attended the Royal School in Dungannon, and he actually, one of his poems is the kind of the school song of the Royal School in Dungannon now. But I'm going to have a wee man reading this poem for you. I'll see if I can get a picture of him for you if I reckon this. This wee man here, Bertie Price, I recorded this poem. I was a BBC producer, history producer for 14 years, by the way, that's why I have these recordings. This wee man recorded it for me when he was 88 years old. It's a really lovely recording, and I hope you'll be able to hear it well enough in this speaker. The poem will, you don't really need an explanation for it, and hopefully the slides will all work.
There were no great offset anywhere, the sculptors of times ago, for drink, and followed them like a curse when brought them on the toe. Replenishment, huh? They're never alone, objected to what they'd steal, and they'd make their children go out and beg for copies and your meal. I knew a sculptor once walked in shame. He was a drunken scrub. But he reared a son, and I mind that son a smart wee lump of coal. His clothes were like wings, even his cap was torn, and his fire was the fire of the town. And he went to school in his wee bare feet, and he never got half his fall. Above the mill there was a big steep hill where he could see to the graveyard wall, to the market house, the station gates, and the new apron in the wall. You could hear him singing going up that hill, but God knows when he sung, because the people said, see the day when his dad was sure to be hung. When the trough was near, he marked the road with his drumsticks in his hand. And boy, he was good at the double roll and the lip of an outdone jam. He played his loan, for the other Wales was ashamed to hang on his rags, so he turned with his hoop and he wadded the burn. And he yelled for spiffly bags. I made the years to go up with me. The ploughing had just begun. And as I watched him, leading the horses round, that drunken sculpture sung, for little I thought that in times to come, I more than a son he'd be. For his father died in a weather shock, and he come to love with me. He was odd and a way, for I think he heard what nobody else could hear, and he seemed that I could never say, although my sight was clear. The top of a hill bewitched him still, the fire of the mountain drum, but the best of all was the running burn, because he said that song to him. There was them that took it on themselves to say he was sure to turn out white. But that young lad grew till he grew man back, but he kept the heart of a child. The longer I lived about the place, the less I had to fear, and there was never a word for him to me, but damn me good to hear. But I'm lonesome now, for he went away. Nice it's getting done. But I didn't have to hold him back when I needed men to come. He's sleeping now, where the bodies grow. And I cooked at the bullets to her. And what is it a wheen of medals to me, when my own wee lad's no more?
It's a nice wee poem, that one, isn't it? So quite sad. It's quite sad. I'll maybe cheer you up by reading you a silly one after that. We'll see what time we have. I've been coming up through the decades and through the generations, you know, showing you how the Ulster Scots language that we would talk about now, it used to be a language, it used to be something totally distinct, or very much distinct from English, that if you heard somebody saying it, what on earth are they talking about? It became less and less and less dense right through until we get to that kind of poetry where, yes, there's the odd word, there's the word like a shach or thole or thran, you know, the words we mentioned earlier that children nowadays wouldn't really know. I said to somebody the other day, it could be in thran, the next door neighbour's child, they hadn't a clue what that was, you know, so couldn't really think of a better word either, so carnaptious is a bit too grown up, so Seamus Heaney was from Balachi, you know, up in County Londonderry, again an Ulster Scots heartland, and he talked quite a lot about this and did quite a few interviews, saying whenever he was trying to write poems, particularly English poems, the word he wanted was a Scots word. He thought, oh, if I put that, I'm going to have to do a glossary, I'm going to have to explain what it means, and yet sometimes those words, like if you look at the sentence, Thon our pachel couched into the shach, up to his oxters and glar. Now you know what I'm talking about there, but there's barely an English word in that sentence. So if Seamus Heaney wanted to talk about Gnarl Pachel couching into his shach, he would have that clumsy old gentleman topped over into a muddy ditch. It's just not as poetic somehow. But he wrote a poem called A Birl for Burns, in which he kind of pays tribute to Robert Burns and the fact that he was empowered to write in his own language, making no apology for using the words that were in common usage nowadays. Hopefully this will play for you.
From the start, Burns' birl and rhythm, that tongue the Ulster Scots brought with him, as stick to still in County Antrim was in my ear. From east of Ban it westered in on the Derry air. My neighbours toved and bummed and blowed, they hacked themselves until it thawed. By slaps and styles they thrawed and tholed and snedded thistles, and when the reeds were braked and hoed, they'd wet their whistles. Old men and women getting crabbed would hark like dogs who'd seen a rabbit, then straighten, stared, and have a stab at standard heavy. Custom never staled their habit of quoted rabbi. Leg lifting, heartsome, like some Burns, he overflowed the well-wrought urns, like buttermilk from slurping churns, rich and unruly, or dancers flying, doing turns at some wild hoolie. For Rabbie's free and Rabbie's big, his stanza may be tight and trig, but once he sets the sail and rig, away he goes, like tam o'shanter o'er the brig, where no one follows. And those first tongues going, gone, and word lists now get added on, and even words like strown and thrawn have to be glossed. In Burns's rhyme, they travel on and won't be lost.
You see what he's talking about there? He's saying that it's a way of almost immortalising these words, is putting them into poetry, and that's one of the reasons why we have to be appreciative of the Rhyming Weavers, because so many fabulous words we would have lost completely, but they're in those poems. And whenever I'm reading the poems and coming across really great words, the favourite word recently is the Ulster Scots word for a handkerchief, a snootclut. Isn't that a brilliant one? Like cluts or cloths, and you snoot your nose, and it's in this poem we start a snootclut. So, but I'm trying to integrate these words a little bit in a subtle way without being a complete nutcase into conversation every day. But if I say to somebody, oh, it's a bit cold, have you got a snootclut? That's not going to catch on really, only in a way of really laughing and appreciating it. But there are other words that I try to sneak in as often as I possibly can. Now, I've got 2 minutes before I finish. I want to read you a poem by a man called Charlie Gillen. He is a living man, he's still going. He's a very modest man. He works and lives up in Dervick, and he writes very humorous poetry in the Ulster Scots style, which is just the way he talks. He doesn't have any kind of third level education, he didn't go to university, nothing like that, and just in the best way that all the Weaver poets did. He writes his poems to read to his mates. You have to go down to the pub and say, here, will you hear this funny old thing I wrote today? So it's proper vernacular poetry and needs no translation. Now what you do need here is to imagine that I'm a young man heading out curtain for me to read this. That's set in the scene. I don't do it as well as a man does it, obviously, and a friend who does it with actions and all kinds of carry on, I'll not do that. But just imagine I'm some kind of a yokel farmer heading out curtain. Long ago, when I was young and wages wasn't big, £6.10 for 50 hours looking after our moors pigs. When I got my first week's wages, I was in a kind of a trance. I looked at my 3 shilling and says I'm for a dance. So I polished up my beetle books and gien mysel a steep. If they played a ween of waltzes, I'll burn them off their feet. So I sprayed a load of oxters and puthered on my feet in case that they get scarlet with dancing in the heat. I looked into the looking glass, boys, I was looking sharp. Then I struck after my clarins for a pint of twire harp, for a couple of maxi boiler for chatting up the women, but take it kind of candy for they didn't like you steaming. Well, I wheeled out the old bicycle and I put on both my clips to keep the new bell bottoms frae cracking like whips. It was a tick down push on the one, and my poor wee legs was sore, but I could think of nothing but burling round the floor. Whenever I got near the ha, I already heard the ban, so I fired the old bicycle and hit the creamery stand. I surveyed the Hallan occupants with a very casual glance. They were hurkled up in corners. Well, says I'm here to dance. Oh, as nice a bunch of lassies as you'd ever hope to meet, but the only yin that would dance with me had perfect size of feet. She was 6'3" and 16 stone, with shoulders like a horse. The only thing that helped her was her friend was even worse, for she had legs like horses' hams and her jazz was clapping in. Her hair was like a socket rhyme, and Lord, but she was thin. The big yin riz, and I looked up at the stibbles in her chin, and the hair of Lower Oxters would have minded you in winds. Well, she grabbed me like a wrestler. I heard my wee ribs cracking. Says she, I always danced with her, saying no use at the back end. Well, the band started playing, and she let out the clutch. No another sound got on the floor, she was speltering that much. She looked to hae some freckles, her legs was mazeled with the fire. But that freckles wasn't freckles, she'd been brushing out the byre. When the waltz was o'er, she set me in a form, and she drew a clout across her brow and says, I'm damped, it's warm. Says I'm going out for a smoke, I'll see ye in a minute. She'd just announced a war horse from somewhere down her summit. Says young lassie shouldn't smoke. Says she, that's the truth. And she sticked a wallet off it and stuck it in her mouth. She says, now just you sit there, for I'm on go down the stairs. The alien, she can wear, for they seem to hunt in pairs. I waited for a minute till I got her in the loo, and says if you're to escape frae dawn, you better do it now. So I ran while I was able to where the bicycle was hidden, for I was glad and thankful to be rid of dawn big midden. They say she owned her own wee farm, but even she had two. The thought of dawn big woman makes me tremble even now. Imagine dawn getting into bed, that would make your blood run cold. We are glassy in a jam pot and the false teeth in a bow. So that's the kind of carry-on we're getting nowadays. So that was all a bit of nonsense. Probably not what you were expecting at all for your lunch break. But I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been a fun introduction to the Rhyming Weavers, so you can understand a wee bit now what this chapter is in Ulster's literary story. So these guys, they were weaving, they were important in our economics, they were important in our culture, they were important in our literature. They lived against the background of the French Revolution, the American War of Independence, the 1798 Rebellion, the two great wars. They were living through it all, and their language and their writing it lets us see what all those things were like for the real common man. It's preserved people, places and events, and it has also preserved this beautiful Scottish vocabulary that's completely disappearing nowadays from the modern world, which I think is a real pity. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much.